Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and this week I'm discussing Pygmalion, written by George Bernard Shaw. And this play was published in 1912 and first performed in 1913. I first read this play my junior year of college for my drama studies course, and we read a bunch of classic plays. So there are other ones I eventually want to get to, but this is my first time discussing a play on this podcast, as a matter of fact. And it's about time, honestly. This play has been adapted so many times in so many different ways in movies and television. And I remember an episode of Family Guy parodied this with Stewie helping that girl Eliza Pinchley. And if you recall last year, when I discussed the show Selfie, created by Emily Kapnick, that show is a parody, a modern-day parody of Pygmalion. And Pygmalion itself is an ancient Greek mythology in which Pygmalion falls in love with one of his sculptures, which then comes to life. So the idea of, in this play, with Professor Henry Higgins taking on Eliza Doolittle, this woman of low status and who doesn't speak properly, and he being a professor of phonetics, and then he makes a bet with Colonel Pickering to teach Eliza manners and how to speak properly. So in the show Selfie, which sadly, by the way, isn't on Hulu anymore, just on a side note, but that show, it's about a woman named Eliza Dooley, and then she goes to her coworker Henry Higgs, played by John Cho, and Eliza Dooley is played by Karen Gillan, and she is so obsessed with herself and with social media, so then he helps her to be more compassionate, to take an interest in others, but likewise she helps him to not be so uptight, to have more fun. And it was alluding to them basically eventually getting into a relationship, even though sadly that show was canceled after only one season. So with this play, similarly, it's considered a romance, even though there isn't, with the two main characters, it's kind of going through the tropes of if they will fall in love. But when I first read this play and discussing it with my class back in college, I still feel this way revisiting it now, that I don't feel any romantic chemistry between the two characters, and I'm glad they didn't end up together, because Eliza, as we know, ends up marrying Freddie. And Freddie, though, he's only in the first act. This play is 5 acts. So this whole premise, as I mentioned, another popular movie is My Fair Lady. That's similar to the plot of this play. Because Higgins, he's really just so uptight and so arrogant, unbelievably arrogant. Like, not very likable at all, if you ask me. Just so thinking he's so great. Like, ugh, God, like, who are you? And then it's funny, though, when he's interacting with his mother, and his mother always telling him to mind his manners. So when he takes on Eliza, because she goes to him wanting lessons. And so many things I forgot about this. I didn't even realize the fact that we don't actually see the lessons of him teaching her to speak properly. It's just in Act 2 when she approaches him, and then he agrees, because after he makes the bet with Colonel Pickering, and then the housekeeper takes her to go take a bath, and they burn her old clothes, because she's just this lowly flower girl when we meet her in Act 1, just selling flowers, when she first runs into Freddie, who is Clara's brother, and their mother is Mrs. Eynsford Hill, who are these people of high social status leaving a party. So then when Higgins decides to take on this project of improving Eliza's way of speaking, the housekeeper, Mrs. Pierce, is telling him afterwards to mind himself and be wary of not using that word that starts with a B. She talks about that, saying how Eliza said it when she went to the bath. And she says that, oh, you, sir, as in Higgins, always say that word when you refer to just this morning, the butter on your bread and your boots. You say, oh, well, I like the alliteration. And the word she's referring to is bloody, which is essentially a curse word. And then by the end, Higgins just says that we've taken on a big job when he's talking to Pickering. So then in Act 3, it's already months later, and we just see how Eliza has transformed. So everything has already happened by then when she goes to meet Mrs. Higgins, Henry's mother. And she's talking properly now because at the start, in those first 2 acts, she has this Cockney accent. And I remember when we read it in class and people were trying to imitate the accent, it was just so awkward, like trying to really have that Cockney accent to really try to capture the voice, because it's part of Eliza's growth in this play, of her essentially being uneducated. And also there's the thing with her father, who basically just sells her in a way. He just asks Higgins for money, and he's terrible. He doesn't care about his daughter at all. Henry's mother, though, because Eliza, she has a stepmother, and she has no relationship with her father at all, really. But Henry's mother holds him to high standards and is always criticizing him. And at the end of Act 3, she's just very exasperated, saying, "Oh, men, men, men." But Higgins, though, is just happy that his experiment with Eliza went well, with her speaking properly, having good manners. And he preps his mother beforehand, saying, "Oh, Eliza has been instructed to only talk about health and the weather." And his mother is basically admonishing. And then in Act 4, it's the whole scene, which I did remember, the whole thing with the slippers, when Eliza's just very hurt because she finds out that Higgins had that bet with Pickering. And Higgins, though, basically takes a liking to Eliza, because there's also some foreshadowing when Higgins' mother was speaking with him, saying, "Why don't you," he says he's a confirmed bachelor, and she says, "Oh, you should try taking an interest in younger women." And he says, "Well, what will younger women have anything to do with me?" And that's alluding to Eliza, since he's roughly 40 and she's roughly 20 years old, so there's that 20-year age gap between them. But then in Act 4, it all comes to a head when Eliza, in her anger, when he's looking for his slippers, then she just throws the slippers at him and saying, "Oh, you just used me for a bet." And she's hurt because Eliza had enjoyed living there with him and with Pickering, and then it's really just cheapens everything, that he essentially doesn't respect her. So she's really hurt and angry, and then she throws a ring at him that he had given her. And then afterwards, when he leaves, she goes to take it out of the fireplace again, because then he ends up losing his temper with her. And he can't understand at first why she's so upset, and he's saying, "Oh, you can still get married." And then in Act 5, back in Mrs. Higgins' house, when Mr. Doolittle, Eliza's father, returns and saying that he's going to get married to Eliza's stepmother, and Higgins just accuses him of being drunk, but then they leave to go to the wedding. And Eliza also talks to Pickering, and when she first enters, she's just very composed, and that now she's no longer the flower girl she once was. And there's a great line in particular where she says, "The difference between a lady and a flower girl is not how she behaves, but how she's treated. I shall always be a flower girl to Professor Higgins, because he always treats me as a flower girl, and always will. But I know I can be a lady to you, because you always treat me as a lady, and always will." And she's talking to Pickering. So in a sense, Pickering becomes this fatherly figure for her, someone she respects. And there's no respect really with Higgins, because he's so pretentious. And when he's telling her, when it's just the two of them speaking, afterwards, when Higgins goes to follow her out to the balcony, and then she walks back in, and he just follows her back inside. And then he says that she can go on living with him, and she's saying how he just wants her there to be able to pick up his slippers. But she's saying, "Well, now that you've turned me into a lady, what other use do you have for me? There's nothing else left for me here." And he likes this spark that she's always had, really, this spark of fight in her. And he remarks that, "I like you like this," and calls her a pillar of strength. So she sparks all of these intense emotions in him, where he loses his temper a lot with her. There's this passion there. And at one point he even calls her a squashed cabbage leaf. He says, "I have created this thing out of the squashed cabbage leaves of Covent Gardens, and now she pretends to play the fine lady with me." So this whole theme of what's ladylike and how to behave in certain situations to be a person of status and class. When he himself, really, since being a professor of phonetics, that's really all it is for him. That's his best thing he contributes. So when he's saying that she's this masterpiece, because then she remarks about how Freddie wants to marry her, has been writing to her, and he says, I won't waste my masterpiece on Freddie. And she says, well, he cares for me, I will marry him, you'll see. And then when they all depart then, when Mrs. Higgins returns, and they go to the wedding, and then the last moment in the play is just Higgins chuckling to himself at the thought of Eliza marrying Freddie. And then in the whole epilogue, it's revealed that she does marry Freddie, and that they open a flower shop together, but that's not necessarily successful. But with Higgins' pretension, and the fact that he's just saw Eliza as this project, something he can mold and turn into this woman of stature, which he successfully does, but then he's not taking anyone's feelings into account. So even if he did come to fall in love with her, that she's her own person, and she lost the respect she had for him, because as she said, she still respects Pickering. And so Henry clearly is just destined to be in his bachelorhood. So it's a great play, it's just Higgins really is not a likable character, in my opinion. But again, this plot, we've seen it adapted so many times, so one of those universal things about human nature, how one carries oneself. There are a lot of other great existential plays that I've read back in college that I will get to eventually too. And I know apparently there are other adaptations of this play too, where they have Eliza and Higgins end up together, but George Bernard Shaw was very much against that, which makes a lot of sense. So having that integrity with his art, that's something to definitely appreciate and admire. So Eliza with her headstrong personality and Higgins with his arrogance, they really just butt heads. So in that sense, there is that spark with them. But I stand by that I'm glad they didn't end up together, that I'm glad it wasn't a romantic relationship, even if it was alluded to, because she did grow and change and get what she wanted out of it, and he did too in winning the bet. So a really great, timeless play. And with that, that is going to conclude this week's episode of Storytelling Saga. You can follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Storytelling Saga, as well as on Twitter at Storytell Saga. You can also send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by leaving me a message in the contact section of storytellingsaga.com or by sending me an email at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Next week, I'm excited to welcome back Patricia to the podcast, and this time we will each be sharing our top 5 favorite animated protagonists. Until then, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.